Hello, everyone. Welcome to CyVerse's Spring 2024 webinars. I'm Tina Lee, CyVerse's User Engagement Officer. We are pleased today to host our webinar on User Experience 101 for data scientists and research software engineers, presented by my colleague, Mariah Wall. I'm going to first take care of some very light housekeeping, and then Mariah will take over. I'm sorry, I'm having to admit people as we go along. Today's webinar is about 30 minutes long with plenty of time for your questions at the end of the presentation. Please open your Zoom chat window and type questions there for Mariah. She'll answer them after she's done. As always, we do record our webinars, and I'll post the video recording and her slide deck on our website and as well as up on our YouTube channel. So now I'm pleased to introduce Mariah, our user interface and application developer. Mariah received her Master's of Science degree in user experience last year from Arizona State University. She started working for CyVerse as a student, and now she applies her specialized skills in UX and UI to designing interfaces for CyVerse, such as for Cacao, which is CyVerse's cloud native platform, as well as other projects. Welcome, Mariah.
Hi, everyone. So this is my first time giving a talk, so I apologize, a little nervous. As Tina mentioned, I've been doing this for about 7 years now, and I'm really excited to hopefully have you walk away today with some actionable advice and ideas of how to apply usability and UX to your existing applications, or if you're looking to design one later. Out of curiosity, you could do a little show of reaction hands if you are currently a developer working on maybe a research application. Okay, great. And do a reaction if you are looking to design one in the future, you haven't started yet. Okay, awesome. So the big question, why is usability so important? And why is user experience so important? User experience, as you just caught, we get mixed up with just usability a lot, but user experience actually encompasses all of these things you see on the screen here. And we could really spend an entire presentation talking about each one. But today I'm going to focus more on how to make sure your existing or future products are usable. Another big reason your user experience is important because it does include accessibility and inclusion. So there could be some things that you might not think about right away. For example, there's a lot of color blindness. So you need to make sure that you have symbols and you don't rely on color alone to indicate that there is an issue. I would go into presenter mode, but I kind of need to have the ability to switch screens easily with sharing. So if it's okay with everyone, it's easier for me this way. And these slides are going to be available after the talk. So I've peppered the slides with links to learn more, so we don't spend too much time on each slide. So general good rule of thumb when you're designing your application is, again, just make sure you don't rely on color alone to indicate on your UI. And then also you have the ARIA rules so that people's screen readers can know what it's reading. So it's easier to do this with HTML, but with React applications, you have to put a little bit more effort and study into making sure that your React applications have those tags in them for screen readers. And then something that gets me a lot when I'm doing visual design for applications is I have to make sure the color I'm choosing has high enough contrast. So there's free checkers online, and you should always make sure that your colors are dark enough that your text is easily readable for people with all different sight abilities. And then also, good experience leads to conversion rates. Whether your app is for profit or is a nonprofit, you're looking for a conversion somewhere. Whether that's purchasing a plan or subscription, donating, subscribing to an event or newsletter, If it's hard to do these tasks, the user will not do these things. So, pro tip, you should always do a test plan on these tasks to make sure that a user can perform these on your website. And always try to find someone who has fresh eyes. Because when you're using it or you're designing it, you become blind kind of to what the flow is, because you know where the button is, but someone else may not. Finally, user experience is really important because a website only has half a second to make a good or bad impression. In contrast, when you meet someone for the first time, you have about 3 to 7 seconds to make an opinion. So for an example, I have GitHub, which I imagine most of us are familiar with. For me, the impression is professional. They're well funded. They're also not afraid to be a little whimsical with their Octocat mascot. The colors are nice. Like, it feels good to be here. Also, they have very clear call to actions, or we call CTAs. If I'm a new user, I know immediately that I can sign up for an account or try a free trial. I also, if I'm an existing user, sign in and sign up are in my expected places in the upper right corner. And the navigation is also where I expect in the upper left corner. And then in web design, we call this above the fold. So when you go to a website for the first time, everything you see first, that's above the fold. That's gonna be your most important actions. So it's important to keep that in mind. If I have to scroll down, I might miss something. So all your most important pieces need to be above the fold. There's a lot of complications in GitHub, a lot of complicated tasks I need to perform. So I really appreciate how they keep their UI pretty clean looking. I don't feel overwhelmed when I look at it. You'll see a lot of white space used. It has a familiar navigation pattern up here again. It has a universal pattern of a social media feed here. These are all things that I'm familiar with. It follows what we call a mental model, my expectations of how things should work based on my past experiences. We all have one. We've all been using websites for years. And when we find that a website goes against this mental model, it can cause confusion. It can make you feel a little upset even. And that adds to what in UX we call cognitive load. So these pain points you run into, like again, a button not being where you expect, can add to your cognitive load. If that load gets high enough, it's a bad experience and you're not going to use this app again or suggest it to anyone. So now, what makes a good user experience? So as I mentioned before, these terms, mental model, expectations, cognitive load, mental effort required to complete a task, and pain points, which is any problems, frustrations, or hiccups when you're doing a task. So these things to me are the recipe for a good experience. You have to make sure you avoid as many pain points as possible to not overload your user. So UX, I would describe simply as don't make me think, which is also the title of the first book you would read when you go in to study UX. No one wants to feel lost and confused when they're using a website. So you'll see here, a user wants to download a file. If the website follows your mental model, usually something like the download button's where they expect it to be, it has a consistent icon with that down arrow, and it's in relation or near the file they want to download. Great, that follows my expectation. You're also going to receive what we call visual status or user feedback. When they hover the button, you'll see a change immediately that you're hovering it, you're interacting with it. And when you clicked it, there was a confirmation. Usually, you select where you want to download and you confirm. Something's happening. I know that I'm being heard in a sense. And then you confirm and you've completed your task. And that would be a good experience. Now, let's say the opposite happens. Let's say the button's too small, you can't read it, it's in a place you don't expect, or it's not clear what you're downloading. That's going to make me feel confused. And if I really can't figure it out, it's going to make me angry. And then I just have to throw in some Ron Swanson here for the bad experience. So if you have an existing application, you're going to want to test for usability. The most common tool a UX designer is going to use is a usability heuristic evaluation. So there's 10 of them that we use. And what we do is we usually have a sheet either that we've created or we use a standard one, usually from the Norman Nielsen group. And we go through the 10 heuristics and we rate on the scale from usually 1 to 4, sometimes 1 to 5, with recommendations and how severe that problem is. So those heuristics, I found this nice graphic online that kind of shows what those are. Visibility of system status. Again, that's just your user feedback. I want to know something's happening when I click on something immediately. If nothing happens within, I think it's a couple of milliseconds, it can give you a momentarily confusion. It could be a pain point. The matching system in real world. Do the buttons match what I expect to happen? Like, does the save button save? Does the down arrow download, up arrow upload, things such as that. Some people try to reinvent the wheel and be fancy and use like their own custom icons, but that can sometimes cause confusion. There is kind of a universal language with icons, so it's usually good to stick with what you've seen other websites use, because again, that will match with your mental model. User control and freedom, you know, how much freedom do I have in your application? How much can I control? Consisting standards, you know, radio buttons, only one should be selected at a time. Check marks, you can have multiple. So these are things you kind of pick up over time that you've learned subconsciously of how you expect things to work. Error prevention is very important. As we know, when you're developing apps, you need error prevention, error handling. If I run into an error, you know what's happening. And I also need you to stop me if I'm doing a destructive action. Something I've found, I'm sure we can all relate to, is we don't like to read. You can put all the work you want into your application to explain this will happen if you click this button, give tips and tricks, but we all just kind of like to click things. And a good user experience will anticipate that and will make sure there's confirmations. For example, deleting something, are you sure? If it actually deleted right when I click delete, I'm going to be shocked and upset. That sounds crazy, but that happens. Flexibility and efficiency of use. So this one is, there should be multiple ways to achieve a goal, multiple paths. There should be 2 or 3 ways to sign up on the web page. I have a personal gripe with Google Docs and Google Slides because I can't just right click and paste. I know this happened to you guys. You'll do that. It'll come up and tell you, no, you need to do Command V or Control V or C. And it gets me every time. I don't know why they have it that way. Aesthetic and minimalist design. This is kind of more about, you don't want to be too wordy, like this presentation maybe, and you don't want to overwhelm the user with too much information. It needs to be nice, clean, lots of white space, feels good to read and look at it. And most importantly, especially in the research field, everything needs documentation. I need to know where to go if I want to learn more about how to use your product. So you should always make sure you have documentation ready when you release your product. Another thing you can do with your existing application is user testing, which you can do anytime. Say you're hanging out with a friend and they haven't looked at your application yet, and you can say, hey, I need your fresh eyes. Take a look. It could be that informal, or it could be very formal. For example, for the DE, we went to the Arizona Research Bazaar, and we had a classroom full of about, I think, 10 to 15 students. We had them set up on Zoom with screen record. We had Google Forms with the task scenarios for them to follow. And we just reminded them, we're not testing you, we're testing the website. Do what you think is best. And it would be helpful if you narrate your thoughts out loud. And you're usually surprised on the results that you get. You can never predict what your results are going to be. Someone will always find something that you can improve on. And I'm going to have slides at the end of this presentation. They'll have links to resources for how to perform your own heuristic evaluation if you're interested in doing that. Now, creating an app from scratch. Ooh, this is my bread and butter, my favorite part. I usually work in, or would like to work in, a traditional UX process. This usually happens about 3 months before any coding is done. But a lot of people don't find that fun. So you're going to spend quite some time coming up with your strategy. Why are you making this app? Who is it for? How is this going to work? And your research. You may be, let's say, a data scientist yourself, or you work in that field, but you can't trust yourself as that user. That's a big mistake a lot of people make. Just because you have certain pain points that you want to fix doesn't mean that someone else next to you have the same. So it's still very important to interview your colleagues, other people in your industry, and keep an open dialogue and ask discovery questions, open-ended discovery questions. Hey, how do you do this? Tell me about your day. What tools do you use? And try not to ask any leading questions. And sometimes you'll be surprised what they say, and you can incorporate into your application. That also falls into surveys and interviews. You can do that informally or formally. We've done this with Google Forms and SurveyMonkey, I believe. So that's how you get more quantitative information, such as your demographics, education level. It's usually good to ask, for example, what browsers they use, if they use their phones or their desktops, things such as that, because when you're designing, you usually have to prioritize one or the other. Everything should be mobile, but I know with our complicated research tools, sometimes that can be tough, especially with dealing with massive amounts of data. Finally, you distill all this information into what you call personas. You maybe create a group of your users that you may consider, maybe they're new to the industry. They don't have a lot of experience. So these are going to be probably your low technical people. And you have one for mid and for high, like your expert, your power users. And this way you can make sure your app caters to all three levels. And you give your personas a name, a background, motivation, and goals. And that kind of helps you imagine that you're them going through your application. And then once you get that down, you're gonna make your wireframes, prototyping. Your prototypes can either be in Figma, so they're image-based, and you can test on those prototypes. A lot of people I work with prefer to make MVPs, or minimally viable products. So they have small prototypes that they could use, send to any user anywhere, and they can test it that way. You're going to do probably about 3 cycles of working on your prototype, testing, getting your results, and implementing those results until maybe finally stop getting the same issues, or you start getting too many issues, too many big issues. There's always going to be, again, something to improve. So the CyVerse product that we did the traditional process on would be the discovery environment. I don't know if anyone here has ever used the old one from back in 2010, but we started a revamp in about 2019. So this is what it looks like now. We developed our strategy, which is we don't want to alienate existing users. So we need to make sure that the same task can be performed. And we don't want to overload new users. So we performed our research. We asked existing users about what they liked about their current workflow, any features that occur in app they liked or disliked, how they work around those issues, and what other tools outside the E that they use and why. We relied heavily on our power users. And we distilled these interviews into the 3 personas, which we've created: the low tech, intermediate, and high technical. So again, user interviews and surveys. So this kind of just tells you more about how to do this. Here's an example of personas. You can have fun with your personas. I am a huge Futurama fan, so I like to name my personas after Futurama characters. These particular personas were for the CyVerse.org website when I was working on a redesign for it. So you don't need too much. You just need their motivation, needs, and goals for your website, and any challenges you expect that they may have. For example, they might not know if the webinars are free. How do you let them know that they're free? They have questions such as that. So for the DE MVP, we focus on our low technical tasks that we want everybody to be able to use. And we save the rest of the tasks for later. And this was great because we prevented what we would call scope creep on the MVP, which can make it take way too long to code. So you have to do the best you can to keep your scope for your MVPs very small and very basic. Once we defined our scope, we then created user stories. So this kind of helps you define the structure of your application, how many views you have, or pages you need, and what steps a user needs to take to achieve that task. And that can take some time. Sometimes you think like, oh, I can just think it through, it'll be fine, but you need to have post-it notes, you need to have, or the digital equivalent of it, and you need to work with your team because you might miss a step, you might miss something. Everyone has different mental models of how something should work, and that's why it's always good to have as much feedback as you can at these stages. The more time you spend in these stages before you go to code, the less coding time and the less money you have to spend on those coding hours if you do the prep work. Once you have user stories, you can then move into low fidelity wireframes. I really emphasize low fidelity. It should be pencil on paper, really basic, no color, very little text. You just want to indicate where you want the buttons to be with the navigation, because I learned this the hard way coming from my background as a graphic designer. I want to make everything I did really pretty. The second you add color, no one wants to talk about the structure of the app or the layout of things. They just want to talk about what shade blue to use or what font to use. So avoid that mistake and just keep your wireframes very simple. The other reason for this is if you spend a lot of time on something, you are going to be more biased and you want to hold on to that you made. The less work you spend on it, the easier it's going to be to scrap it for a new idea. Once you get the low fidelity wireframes agreed on with your group, and you kind of follow your own flow with it, you kind of do like a paper testing, like you follow along with your finger. They go here, they go there, they go here. And when you feel like that's a pretty solid path, then you can move on to high fidelity wireframes. So most people I work with React applications. So we usually come up with, or we agree on, a design system to use. For example, most of CyVerse products use material design, and we use a lot of components from the material UI component library. I included a link for you to explore later if you'd like. And other UI libraries you'll find us using would be Chakra, some Tailwind, and Bootstrap. Actually, I have a question for the group. Does anyone here have a favorite design system or UI library they like to use? You can put it in the chat if you'd like. So again, in high fidelity wireframes, when you have the UI system and library figured out, then you can do the visual part better. You can kind of anticipate what components you're going to use and how they're going to look. So now your wireframes have a little bit more life in them, and they're in between that stage of wireframes and full-on prototype. So here I have a little bit more color to show the data screen is active. You'll see more hints of content where it's going to be checkboxes for interaction. They can switch from grid to list view here. So these are some concepts that we were looking at here. This, as you can tell, looks way different from the final product. Then you move on from there to a prototype. We used InVision for the DE, and InVision is no longer around, so I can't access those prototypes anymore. Programs you could use today would be Adobe XD and Figma. Both have free plans. Actually, I think Adobe XD is completely free. Figma has a starter plan. So you could use PowerPoint in a pinch. I've done that before. I don't recommend it because you lose the ability to show the interaction design. So I wanted to show you an example of a Figma prototype that I've done. In this case, it was for MD Repo. So I'm going to change my screen. All right, so here you should see the Figma application. And let's see, here it is. So this is the prototype that I made. You have the indication of the search, logo, lockup, breadcrumbs, things like that. So again, because this is a Figma prototype, you can actually interact with it. You can kind of see a little bit of how navigation would work. Search, click on that, download button. So this is helpful to kind of, discuss with others how something should look, spacing, things like that. So only when you get your prototypes really down, you then move on to development. And that saves a lot of time on guesswork for the developers when you have a really good prototype. So today, MD repo looks like this. So this is the actual website now that they have. So we have, again, the familiar navigation pattern up top. You know exactly what they're about. Call to action is to search. We have hints for the user, enter 3 characters at search suggestions. But again, people don't read, so they're just going to start typing. But you can see there's something going on here. There's a wheel showing me that I was thinking. Let me just flash it for a second. So you have results here. So we're really proud of this one. This was what we used in what we call a lean UX process because we had a few months to create a product. We did not have time for traditional research. Back to the DE. Once we had our MVP, we did testing. And we collected the results in an Excel sheet. You kind of see hints of that here. We were determining, why was it somewhat difficult? Trying to figure out suggestions. And we did, I believe, about 3 rounds of testing until we released the first version of the stable release. Now, again, in this field, a lot of people are going to be working in the agile software development. So lean UX process. So again, with MD Repo, we had, like I said, about a couple months to come up with something that's viable. So you went right into sprint planning and we followed this cycle. So you kind of build first, ask questions later. So we built something, performed testing, implemented it, and go through that cycle again and again. So this is a lot more coding time, but the nature of the field, it works pretty well. Products that use this, let's say Cacao is a combination of it. We had some time to do some traditional research before we got started, but it is in a constant state of collecting feedback and implementing that feedback, and we're always adding new features. And then there's always opportunities to add better usability to it too. For example, about last month, it didn't tell you that you had 3 months and X amount of days left your current allocation. It just told you that it was going to end soon or end on a certain date. So we just kind of do things to make it a little bit easier, less cognitive load to figure out information. At a glance, I know how long I have and when it expires. And I even have an indication of, I'm this far in my cycle and I only use this much. So I find that pretty nice. And again, we use Google on material design, so you'll see a familiar dashboard pattern for that. MD Repo, like we talked about. And then we also did the lean UX process for the tutorial classroom chatbot. So this was kind of a hackathon. Basically, day 1, I made high-level wireframes and prototypes, and they made it real within 3 days. That was pretty impressive. I have a slide here for reference later, if you'd like, just kind of more defining the pros and cons of doing traditional versus lean. And then, again, just to show you how user experience is a lot of layers to it. So this is best described by Jesse Garrett's 5 layers of user experience. You can do this exercise with any website you go to. You have the concrete, which is what you see visually right away. You have the colors, the buttons, images, and the fonts. This is the completed product that you're looking at. You can also break it down to the skeleton and the structure. And then from there, you can surmise the scope and the strategy. But when you're making your app for the first time, you're going to start from the abstract to the concrete. You're going to start from strategy up. You work on your strategy, your scope, your structure, skeleton, and surface. A lot of people think only a good looking UI contributes to a good UX. That is not true. You can have a ugly website that is still very usable, such as Craigslist or Wikipedia. I don't think they're pretty, but they're useful. So I do want to show you some common traps when you're doing design thinking. I really like this comic. I think it explains it pretty well. Emphasize, again, you are not the user when you're designing it. You need to rely on your user research. You cannot rely on your own imagination and opinions of how things could work. You can try starting off that way as a starting point, but you can't rely on it. You need to reach out and ask other people and interview and survey. Because you're not going to know everything. In fact, you should always be looking to see if someone can prove you wrong. If someone could change what you expected them to say. Number 2 and 3 is define and ideate. I also call this scope creep, which I'll show you here. It's very easy. We all get carried away with all the features that our application should have. But then you run out of time, or it's actually not feasible, when really all the user needed was something very basic at the time. You can always add more later, but when you're doing your first pass, it's best to just really focus on the actual user needs. Prototype, again, like I said, PowerPoint, maybe if you really can't access the other programs, but you just can't get the same effect unless you use Figma or Adobe XD. And then testing. Testing is important to be, again, open to discovering things, and you have to be open to being wrong. Sometimes people write leading test questions, like go to sign up, which tells the user, oh, I'm going to look for a button called sign up, rather than saying a test scenario, such as you are a student and you need to make an account before you can join your class. That's kind of a more open-ended scenario. And you'll have to see if that user does decide, oh yeah, I'm looking for sign up. Or they might decide, I need to find something just for students. So that could affect what they do in your test. And then finally, implementation. You really make sure you actually implement those changes and test them before you release. But that's probably be more on your development practice. And then again, my last piece of advice for good usability or good user experience is to not reinvent the wheel. Again, some people just want to be really different. They'll put the navigation somewhere unexpected. They'll use colors that they haven't seen around, but sometimes, there is a reason why we use certain color palettes. There is a reason why we use certain fonts, and there is a reason why we use the same icons, within all our websites. It's kind of a shared language, and you don't want to break that. And I do want to show you, before I end the presentation, my reference slides. I hope, again, that you leave this presentation wanting to learn more about usability. So I have some books that were my favorite when I was going through my master's program. If you have an account with Arizona or ASU, you can read these for free. Don't Make Me Think, again, is one of the first books you read. We have the Usability Laws by John Jablonski. So these are great. They're just kind of quick explanations behind the psychology of why we do things a certain way in UX, such as, for example, you don't want your UI to be too complicated because the average person can only process seven things more or less at a time. I also really enjoyed 97 Things Every UX Practitioner Should Know. And Tips on Your Own Heuristic Evaluation. And I also, in case you are interested in hiring a UX or UI person for your team, I made a little guide to kind of show you what kind of contractor you might be looking for. You're going to be looking at your deliverables. So depending where you are in your project and what kind of deliverables you want, will influence what kind of contractor you might want or what kind of person you want to hire. Like everyone else here, usually they do 3 jobs. So you can usually find a designer that can do some UI and some research. But just focus on your deliverables and I'll help you decide on who to hire. And that's the end of my presentation. Does anyone have any questions or would like me to go over anything in more detail?
Thanks, Mariah. There are no questions in the chat, but
Mhm.
if people want to unmute and just ask questions, we're a small enough group where that'll work. Yes, thank you. There's a lot of information, right? And
Which
we
I
all, I think, know what's when we've had bad experiences. So yeah, did somebody have a question? Devin.
Hi, that was a great presentation, Mariah. Thank you. My question has to do with something that I run into in visualization stuff. So in UX UI, is there such a thing as necessary junk? Like in the field, people know that something is efficient or has cognitive load, but it's so ingrained that people are used to seeing it and it causes more confusion if that tradition isn't followed.
So I think I know what you're talking about. And yeah, there's kind of the nature of this field. Like there's a lot of information, a lot of complex tasks that has to be done. So I would look into seeing, there's kind of a way to kind of hide additional information. I don't know if maybe this would be a good example, but we had this issue with MD repo. Let me see. Because there's a lot of information that they needed here. So we try to hide things so we don't overload the UI. For example, if they want to learn more about biomolecules, they could expand it, process files. So if they expand everything, like it does get longer, but there is a way to start off with a simpler screen. I don't know if that answers your question. Would there be a way to, you can still have that complex information, but is there a way to kind of put it under a broader category that they can expand if they want more?
Yeah, I think, maybe the best example of it would be, you said it's good to stick to the standards for icons, but have you found an icon where you're like, ah, dang it, this is the standard, but I kind of hate that icon?
I have that with some calendar icons. Sometimes they look like a car battery to me.
Nice. Yeah, that would be sort of my example of like the junk that people are just used to seeing, so we have to go with it.
Yeah, another issue I still deal with sometimes too is, some of these are very abstract concepts. Like let me see, like images or templates for cacao, for example. So actually I'll go to it right now. So one of my challenges is trying to figure out how do I represent templates as an icon. So we use widgets to kind of show kind of a catalog, kind of like an app library, so with that. And then I can't find the other example that I had. But yeah, sometimes it can be a challenge to find what is the right icon, and it's okay to experiment. You can put in one and see if anyone has trouble finding it. That's why user testing is so important, and it's good to do it often. Are there any other questions?
Other questions for Mariah? I guess, Mariah, I had one in terms of the traditional versus the lean UX process. Is it just really that if you have a certain limited time, you would just go lean, or is there actually an advantage of using the lean process?
I find that a lot of projects will start off, if they have the funding and the time, they'll start off with traditional UX, but eventually they'll turn into lean. So what happens is, say you just stick with traditional and then it gets passed off to developers and they work on it, but if there's user feedback, things like that, the developers, may not know how to recommend good UX solutions for those problems. And that's why it is important for, I think, research teams to always have someone on staff that knows about usability, so they could take that feedback and make it into actionable, implementable solutions that the developers can do. Because the developers have enough on their plate, making everything work. So a lot of projects, I would say nowadays, probably use both. Start off traditional, and then they go into lean. Usually for hackathons, or again, if you are having like a very short timeline, like you have a month to do this, Lean would be very helpful because you have to start coding. You just have to. You have to start, getting those backend pieces in place and just hope for the best, test, and implement later.
Okay. Well, if there are no other questions, thank you everyone for joining us today. Please mark your calendars for our next webinar on May 3rd, when Dr. Jeff Gillen presents on geospatial image data analysis using CyVerse. Mariah, thank you so very much. And like I said, we'll be posting this video recording and Mariah's slides on our website. So great, everybody. See you next month.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.